Let me take you into a story you may think you know, yet when you hear it through the eyes of a child, it will strike differently. This isn't just history. It's my grandmother's story, a woman whose quiet strength built the very foundation of our family. She lived through times I can barely imagine. Times when the rules of the world weren't written down for everyone to see, but carved into daily life like scars. Invisible lines divided streets, schools, buses, and even laughter. And yet, through it all, my grandmother carried herself with dignity. She survived, she learned, and she never forgot. She was born in the late 1930s, in the Deep South. For a black child, the world didn't open its arms, it pointed to boundaries and whispered, "Not you." She used to say, "I was a child, but I was never allowed to just be a child." That sentence alone tells you where her story begins. Her earliest memories weren't of birthday cakes or toys. They were of her mother's hands calloused from long hours washing clothes for white families, yet tender when they brushed across her cheek. Her father worked sunrise to sunset in the fields, his back bent but his pride unbroken. Their lives were built on survival. But even in survival, there was pride. She was only 8 when the sting of segregation left its first unforgettable mark. It was a sweltering summer day. She held her mother's hand tight as they walked into town. At a small diner, her grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, wanted to buy her a cold drink. Inside, the counter gleamed, chrome stools lined up like a dream. She tugged at her mother's skirt. "Mama, can I sit there?" Her mother's face stiffened. She bent low and whispered, "Not here, baby. Not us." Instead, they were led to a side window, a wooden sign above it reading colored. Same soda, same price, but it didn't taste the same. My grandmother remembered the burn in her chest, not from the heat, but from the confusion. "Why them and not me?" she asked. Her mother's voice was soft but steady. "Because that's how they want it. But it doesn't mean you're less." That day, she didn't understand the word segregation. But she understood rejection. And rejection leaves marks even on a child. School drove the lesson deeper. Her one-room schoolhouse leaned at the edges, paint peeling, roof leaking. Books were so scarce that 4 or 5 children had to share one. Just down the road, the white children had a brick building, a library, and a playground with shiny new swings. She would laugh softly when telling me our swings were tree branches. Our books had names in them from kids who didn't look like us. But we learned anyway. Because education was the one thing they couldn't take from us if we held it tight enough. Teachers weren't just teachers. They were shields, role models, and torchbearers. Many had walked through the same storms and wanted the next generation to carry more than wounds, they wanted them to carry hope. She remembered the mantra spoken often, "You'll have to be twice as good, twice as smart, twice as strong, just to stand in the same place as them. Don't you ever forget that." Those words carved themselves into her spirit. Even in play, segregation found its way in. Certain parks were off limits. Certain pools closed their gates. After church on Sundays, she and her friends would pass the town's grand park, iron fence gleaming in the sun. On the other side, white children twirled on the merry-go-round, laughter spilling into the air. "I didn't even want the merry-go-round," she once told me. "I just wanted to know what it felt like not to be told no." Even the streets themselves carried rules. If a white person approached, she had to step off the sidewalk. On buses, she sat in the back. Forget the rules, and consequences followed, sometimes a glare, sometimes a word, sometimes worse. One summer evening, her older brother, barely 16, was stopped by a group of white men on his walk home. They accused him of looking the wrong way. He returned with his shirt torn, his spirits shaken. My grandmother remembered her father at the kitchen table that night, fists clenched, jaw tight, silent. A man who worked hard yet could not shield his son from everything. That helplessness haunted the family. It was a reminder the rules weren't just unfair. They were dangerous. But even in a world so bent on saying no, my grandmother found yes. Where was the light? It was in community. In church pews filled with song that rose louder than oppression. In Sunday dinners, where families pooled what little they had and created abundance. In laughter that refused to bow to silence. At night, her mother braided her hair by the glow of a kerosene lamp and whispered, "You are not what they say you are. You are more. You're mine. And you're God's." That voice became her anchor. Again and again, it pulled her back from the edges of bitterness. Her childhood was full of contradictions. A world that told her she didn't matter, and a home that told her she mattered more than she could imagine. Those two truths collided daily. Out of that collision grew resilience. She would later say, childhood wasn't about innocence. Childhood was about learning strength early. And that strength, though born in pain, carried her forward. It became the seed of the woman she would become. Because even as a little girl, standing at a colored-only window or pressing her hand against a park fence, she was already learning something powerful. Dignity wasn't something the world could grant her. It was something she would claim for herself. I was still a girl when I began to notice how deeply family and community held us together. Segregation tried to cut us down at every turn, but it was inside the walls of our home and within the arms of our neighbors that I learned what true resilience looked like. We didn't have much money, but we had rules carved not out of sternness, but out of survival. My mother used to say, if you can't be proud of what you have, then you can't be trusted with more. That meant every corner of our little house was kept clean, every shirt mended, and every meal stretched to feed whoever walked through our door. Food was more than food. It was a message. A plate of cornbread and beans could tell someone, you are welcome. You are safe. You belong. I saw neighbors stop by when they had nowhere else to go, and my mother would just slide another bowl across the table. Even if it meant she ate less, she always fed others first. That's how I learned generosity isn't about how much you have, it's about how much you're willing to share. Sundays were holy for more reasons than one. Church wasn't just worship, it was where we strategized, where we organized, where we leaned on each other. The pastor's sermons thundered with reminders of dignity and courage. He told us to keep our heads high, no matter how many times the world tried to bow them down. The church ladies whispered about which families needed groceries. The men passed around word about jobs or ways to stay safe when trouble stirred. Kids like me learned to sit still in pews, but we also learned that community is more powerful than fear. And the music, Lord, the music carried us. The choir would lift their voices, and even though the world outside the doors might be filled with hate, inside, for those few hours, we were free. Free in spirit. Free in hope. My father didn't talk much, but when he did, his words stayed with you. He'd work long days in fields that didn't belong to him, and at night, when he finally sat down, I'd see the exhaustion in his eyes. But he never once let bitterness rule him. One evening, I asked him how he kept going when the white man who owned the land treated him so poorly. My father leaned back, wiped his brow, and said, "Dignity is something nobody can take from you unless you hand it over. You hear me, girl? They can break your back, but don't let them break your spirit." That was the first time I understood that resilience wasn't about avoiding pain, it was about carrying yourself with honor even while enduring it. We grew up under what I like to call porch light protection. Everyone's porch light served as a kind of neighborhood watch. If something strange happened, eyes turned sharp and voices carried warnings down the street. There was safety in numbers. If a white shopkeeper cheated someone, the word spread before the sun went down, and none of us would spend a dime there again. If a child strayed too far, a neighbor's voice would call them home. Discipline wasn't just a family matter, it was communal. Did I like it when Miss Hattie across the way scolded me for skipping chores? Not one bit. But now, looking back, I see how those little acts of correction were also acts of love. It meant we all belonged to each other. My grandmother, the one I was named after, carried herself like a queen, though she owned nothing but her faith and her hands. She had this way of walking into a room as if the whole world owed her respect, even though she'd never get it from those outside our community. She taught me how to iron clothes until the creases could cut paper. Wrinkles invite judgment, she'd say. She taught me to speak with clarity, even if no one listened. One day, someone will, and you'll be ready. These small lessons stitched pride into me. Not arrogance, but a steady confidence that said, I may not have the world's approval, but I know my worth. Times weren't easy. Jobs were scarce, pay was worse, and opportunity was rationed out like crumbs. But because of that, we learned how to carry each other's burdens. I remember one winter when a family down the street lost their father to illness. They had 6 children, and suddenly no way to make ends meet. Without a word, the women of the neighborhood started cooking double portions, slipping food into baskets, leaving them on their porch at night. My father fixed their roof after work, though his own roof leaked. Nobody asked for thanks. It was just understood, we rise together, or we fall together. The older I grew, the more I realized my family wasn't just teaching me how to survive, they were training me to carry the torch forward. My mother's hands showed me that service was strength. My father's silence showed me that dignity outlasts oppression. My grandmother's poise showed me that pride can be an act of defiance. And the church, the neighbors, the laughter, and even the scoldings, they all showed me that resilience isn't built alone. It's a tapestry woven from every act of care, every shared meal, every word of encouragement. I didn't know then how much I would need those lessons later, when I stepped into the wider world, but those teachings became my armor. When I tell these stories to my grandchildren, I see their eyes widen. They live in a world I couldn't have imagined as a child, one with more doors open, though not all, and more opportunities, though not always equal. I remind them, freedom didn't come cheap. Strength was our inheritance, bought with sweat, tears, and unshakable faith. Because resilience isn't something you're born with. It's something you practice. Day by day, lesson by lesson, struggle by struggle. And it was inside our family and community, inside that web of resilience, that I learned how to hold my head high. By the time I was old enough to leave childhood behind, the world outside was shifting like sand beneath our feet. The air felt restless, full of tension, but also full of possibility. Segregation was still the law in many places, but whispers of change began to stir. People were marching, singing, and organizing, and I knew deep down that I couldn't just sit quietly on the sidelines. I remember the first time I stood my ground against the rules of segregation. I was about 18, riding a bus home from work. The front half of the bus, of course, was for white folks. The back half, hard seats, broken windows, was where we were told to sit. That day, the bus was nearly empty, and I slid into a seat in the middle. The driver barked at me to move. My knees trembled, but something inside me refused. I thought about my father's words, they can break your back, but don't hand them your spirit. So I stayed put. For one long, terrifying minute, I held my ground. Finally, the driver shook his head and muttered under his breath. He didn't force me off, but he made sure to let me know I wasn't welcome. When I got home, I told my mother what I had done. She didn't scold me, but she did grab my hand and whisper, "Child, you're brave. But bravery can cost dearly. Just promise me you'll live long enough to do more than ride a bus seat." That moment taught me something I never forgot. Small acts of defiance are seeds. You never know which one will bloom into change. By my early 20s, I had found my way into meetings, quiet at first, in basements, church halls, anywhere we could gather without drawing too much attention. We planned boycotts. We wrote letters. We trained ourselves in nonviolent protest. I wasn't a leader in the sense of standing on pulpits or leading chants, but I was there. I marched. I sat in. I lent my hands to cooking meals for those who came back weary from rallies. I stuffed envelopes, carried signs, and held the hands of friends when fear tried to silence us. And I learned something important. Change doesn't only come from loud voices. Sometimes it comes from steady, everyday faithfulness. From bodies showing up, again and again, refusing to disappear. Life doesn't pause for justice, though. While fighting for a better tomorrow, I was also building my own. I met a young man named William at a church social. He had a laugh that rolled through a room like thunder and a way of looking at me as if he already knew my story. We courted under the watchful eyes of neighbors because back then, courtship wasn't private, it was community business. We married in a little church, and it was one of the happiest days of my life. Our wedding meal wasn't fancy fried chicken, collard greens, sweet tea, but every bite tasted like hope. Soon after, we had our first child. Holding my baby in my arms, I felt a weight heavier than any chain of segregation, the responsibility to give them a world better than the one I had grown up in. That weight made every march, every protest, every sleepless night worth it. But make no mistake, involvement came with consequences. William lost a job once because he was spotted at a demonstration. I remember the look on his face when he told me, frustrated but not broken. "They think they can starve us into silence," he said. "But I won't stop speaking truth." We endured threats, too. Letters slipped under the door. Anonymous phone calls in the night. Sometimes I woke up with my heart pounding, wondering if tomorrow would bring violence. But fear, I learned, is like smoke. It chokes you if you let it stay inside. So I exhaled it every time and kept moving forward. I will never forget the first time I walked into a restaurant that had once turned us away, and no one stopped me. The sign that had once said whites only was gone. I sat at that counter and ordered a cup of coffee with shaking hands. The waitress set the cup down without a word. She didn't smile. She didn't scowl. She just served me like any other customer. And I sat there, sipping slowly, with tears burning my eyes. To anyone watching, it was just a woman drinking coffee. But to me, it was history. It was resistance turned into reality. One of my proudest milestones came later in life when I went back to school. Growing up, opportunities for education had been scarce, especially for Black girls. But I had always loved learning, and I carried that hunger well into adulthood. When my youngest child was old enough, I enrolled in night classes. Sitting in a classroom surrounded by students half my age, I sometimes felt out of place. But every page I read, every test I passed, felt like reclaiming something that had been denied me. Eventually, I earned my degree. I held that diploma in my hands and thought of my grandmother, who had taught me to iron clothes with pride. I thought of my father, who had insisted on dignity. That piece of paper wasn't just mine, it belonged to all of them, too. With education came new opportunities. I became a teacher, determined to pour into young minds the lessons that had carried me. I told my students the truth, not just about math and literature, but about life. I told them that knowledge is armor, that dignity is power, that resilience isn't weakness, but strength in its purest form. Many of those students went on to do incredible things. Some became leaders, some became parents who raised strong children of their own. And when they came back years later to thank me, I always said the same thing: don't thank me. Thank the people who built me. I'm just passing it forward. Looking back now, I see my milestones not as isolated victories, but as threads in a larger story. The civil rights movement was not a chapter, it was a seed planted deep, watered by sacrifice, and tended by countless hands. And my own journey, marriage, motherhood, education, teaching was a way of carrying that seed forward. I often tell my grandchildren, breaking barriers isn't about fame or recognition. It's about living so fully, so unapologetically, that your very existence cracks open doors for those who come after you. Even now, in my old age, I know the work isn't finished. Injustice still walks among us, dressed in new clothes but speaking the same old lies. But I don't despair, because I've seen too much progress to doubt the power of persistence. I've lived long enough to drink coffee at a counter once close to me. I've lived long enough to vote in elections where my voice once didn't matter. I've lived long enough to see my children and grandchildren walk paths that were once barricaded. And I've lived long enough to know that the fight for justice, for dignity, for equality will never be in vain. When people look at me now, they see an old woman with silver hair, wrinkled skin, and a cane tapping against the ground with each step. But when I look in the mirror, I don't just see age, I see a lifetime layered like bricks, each one carrying a story. Some bricks are heavy with pain, others shine with joy, but together they built the house of my life. And as I stand here in the twilight of my years, I often wonder, what will remain when I'm gone? Will people remember the marches I joined, the classrooms where I taught, the protests whispered about in church basements? Or will they remember smaller things, the way I hummed gospel hymns while frying chicken on Sundays, or the way my laughter filled a room even after long, hard days? The truth is, legacies aren't carved only in marble statues or grand speeches. They're carried in the quiet ways we touch lives, in the seeds we plant that keep on growing long after we're gone. When my grandchildren gather around me and ask for stories, I don't share them just for entertainment. I tell them so they can carry pieces of me forward, like torches lighting their way. I tell them about nights spent huddled in church basements, whispering plans for protests while fear pressed against the windows. I tell them about mornings we walked out knowing danger was waiting, but walking anyway because silence was a greater enemy. I tell them about my first classroom cracked chalkboard, hand-me-down desks, books missing pages, but children whose eyes were wide open with dreams no one could take away. And then I lean close, lowering my voice so they feel the weight of my words. Don't ever let anyone tell you that your voice doesn't matter. Don't you dare shrink yourself to make others comfortable. Because I've seen the cost of believing the lie that you are powerless. When you believe that, you hand over your strength before the fight even begins. If I could bottle up everything I've learned in this life, it would pour into 3 jars: resilience, dignity, and hope. Resilience, because life will knock you down more times than you can count. But each time you rise, you grow roots that storms can't uproot. Dignity, because the world may strip away wealth, jobs, recognition, and even respect, but it cannot take away the way you choose to carry yourself. Walk tall, even with tired feet. Speak truth, even with a trembling voice. Hope, because without it, the soul dries up. Hope is what carried us through Jim Crow, through nights of uncertainty, through times when the future looked darker than the past. Hope whispered that our children might one day live freer than we did. And hope was right. People sometimes ask me, do you still carry bitterness after everything you went through? I've been insulted, threatened, dismissed, overlooked. I've had doors slammed in my face and names hurled at my back. But bitterness? No, I don't hold on to it. Bitterness is a poison that eats the vessel it lives in. Now, don't mistake me, I remember. I remember the faces of men who spat at us. I remember teachers who said I wasn't smart enough. I remember the employers who laughed me out of their offices. I remember. But I do not give them power over my joy. Instead, I pray. I forgive not because they earned it, but because I deserve peace. Forgiveness clears the soil so better things can grow. It makes room for love, and love is the only thing that outlasts hate. When I look back, I can't help but smile at the small victories that once seemed ordinary but were truly extraordinary. The first time I saw a black cashier at the grocery store, ringing up customers without a fuss. The day my daughter came home with her first paycheck from a company that once wouldn't even look at someone like her. To some, these moments were everyday life. To me, they were fireworks, bright proof that every march, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer was not in vain. Sometimes change doesn't roar. Sometimes it tiptoes in quietly, settling itself so naturally that the world forgets it was ever resisted. But I never forget. If I could seal a letter for each of my children and grandchildren, it would read like this: life will test you. Don't expect it to be easy. But don't confuse struggle with failure. Struggle is proof you're alive, growing, reaching for something more. Don't run from it, learn from it. And don't just chase success. Chase meaning. Chase the kind of life that, when you look back, makes you proud to have lived it. Remember this: love is not weakness. Love is the strongest armor you can wear. It carried us when hate tried to smother us. It built families, churches, and movements. And it will carry you, too. For a long time, I thought legacy meant only family parents passing down stories to children. But teaching showed me it's far bigger. Legacy lives in every life you touch. I've had students return years later to say, "You believed in me when no one else did." I've seen neighbors rebuild each other's houses after storms, strangers link arms to face injustice, communities rise again and again after hardship. Legacy doesn't live in a single person, it belongs to all of us who choose to live with courage. Through it all, my faith has been my anchor. I've seen cruelty that could harden a heart forever. But I've also seen beauty that softens even the hardest pain. And somewhere between those two truths is where faith lives. When I stood at the edge of despair, it was faith that steadied me. When William died, and I thought the silence in our house would swallow me whole, it was faith that whispered, "You are not alone." Faith isn't just about sermons or pews. It's about believing there is something greater holding us steady, even when the world tilts beneath our feet. If this is the last story I ever tell, let it be this: we are stronger than we know. Stronger than chains, stronger than hatred, stronger than the lies meant to break us. I was born in a world that told me I was invisible. Yet here I stand, in the twilight of my years, having raised children who became teachers, doctors, entrepreneurs, leaders. I've lived to see grandchildren who travel, vote, and dream without asking permission. That is victory. Not loud, not flashy, but steady, brick by brick, generation by generation. At night, I often imagine holding a torch in my hands. It's heavy because it carries centuries of struggle, but it shines because it carries centuries of hope. My time of carrying it is nearly done. Soon it will pass to my children, to their children, to anyone willing to walk into darkness carrying light. And I pray they hold it high, with the same stubborn fire that carried me. Because resilience is not mine alone. It is ours. It always has been. When I look back now, I understand something I couldn't fully grasp in my younger years. My story was never just mine. Every step I took, every battle I fought, every scar I carried, became the foundation on which my children and grandchildren would stand. That, more than anything, gives me peace in these later years, knowing my sacrifices were not wasted, that they became stepping stones for those who came after me. I remember holding my firstborn in my arms, a tiny bundle wrapped in a faded blanket we could hardly afford. Her cry was soft, her fingers curled around mine, fragile yet determined. In that moment, I made a vow. I swore that my child would never feel the same crushing weight of segregation that had pressed down on my shoulders. I knew the world would not transform overnight, but there was something more powerful I could give her, the unshakable knowledge of her worth. I whispered into her tiny ear, "You are loved. You are worthy. You are enough." And I kept whispering it, child after child, year after year. Those words became a steady drumbeat in our home, a quiet but unyielding shield against a world that tried to convince us otherwise. But whispers alone could never be enough. I knew children don't learn most from what we say, they learn from what we do. So, I walked with dignity even when the world tried to strip it away. When my son once asked why I straightened my back before speaking to a white shopkeeper who wouldn't even look me in the eye, I told him, because if I bow to him, you'll think it's right to bow too. My children's eyes followed me, their ears caught every tone, their hearts absorbed every lesson. My actions became the textbooks they studied most closely. As they grew older, their questions grew sharper, cutting into wounds I thought had already scarred over. Why can't we live in that neighborhood? Why does Daddy have to work twice as hard for half the pay? Why do some people look at us like we don't belong? Each question landed like a stone on my chest, heavy and familiar. Yet I answered as honestly as I could. Because the world is unfair, I said. But unfair does not mean unbeatable. We may not be handed the same chances others are, but we can build our own. And when the world tells you no, you learn to build your own yes. Those words became their armor. I saw it in my eldest daughter, who refused to let teachers talk over her in class, raising her hand higher, her voice steadier, until she could not be ignored. I saw it in my son, who after being denied a promotion 3 times, finally quit and built his own business, carving success from the very stone walls that once tried to block him. Every no they faced became fuel. Every door slammed became a lesson in finding another way. By the time my grandchildren came along, the world had changed in undeniable ways. The whites-only signs were gone. Schools were integrated. Laws had shifted. Opportunities, though not equal, were wider than before. But history leaves echoes, and my grandchildren still heard them. Their struggles weren't marked by the blatant signs I once faced, but by quieter slights, hidden biases, unspoken barriers. One day, my granddaughter came home from college with tears streaking her cheeks. She told me a professor had questioned whether she was really qualified to be in the program. The words rattled her confidence, cracked her certainty. I sat her down, held her trembling hand in mine, and said, "Baby, don't you let anyone make you small. You come from a line of women who stood tall when the world tried to break them. You are not just qualified, you are overqualified, because you carry the weight of every battle fought before you." Her tears dried. Her shoulders lifted. Her eyes sharpened. A week later, she returned with a story that made me smile. She had spoken up in class, challenging that same professor with facts, poise, and undeniable brilliance. "Grandma," she said, "I felt you in the room with me." Hearing that, I knew every hardship I endured had been worth it. It's funny. When you're young, you think legacy is about what you achieve for yourself, the titles, the recognition, the accolades. But when you're older, you realize legacy isn't measured in what you keep. It's measured in what you pass on. My children and grandchildren are walking proof of resilience. They are living monuments carved not from stone, but from love, dignity, and determination. And that, more than any speech I ever gave or march I ever joined, is my greatest victory. Sometimes they ask me, "Grandma, weren't you scared back then? Didn't you ever want to give up?" And I tell them the truth. Yes, I was scared. Yes, I wanted to give up more times than I can count. But every time the temptation to quit grew strong, I pictured their faces even before they existed. I imagined generations not yet born, living freer because I refused to bend. That vision kept my feet moving forward. Now, I see the living answers to the prayers I once whispered in the dark. My son runs his own company. My daughter teaches children, shaping futures with patience and pride. My granddaughter prepares to fight for justice as a lawyer. My grandson builds a nonprofit that lifts children in neighborhoods where hope often feels scarce. Each of them is a line in the ongoing story, proof that what we endure is never wasted when it is carried forward. But even beyond their titles and accomplishments, I see something even more beautiful, the values that flow through them like blood in their veins: dignity, courage, compassion, and faith. They respect others. They speak truth even when their voices tremble. They reach down to lift others as they climb. You see, oppression tried to teach me shame. I turned that lesson upside down and taught my family pride instead. Segregation tried to teach me silence. I transformed it into a lesson in bold speech. Injustice tried to teach me bitterness. I reshaped it into a lesson of love. That is what my family carries now: strength born of struggle, wisdom born of wounds, hope born of hardship. And I pray that one day, long after I am gone, they will sit with their own children and grandchildren and tell my story. Not for pity, not for sorrow, but for power. Because my life is not a tragedy. It is a testimony. In the end, what matters most is not the pain I endured, but the hope I passed on. My legacy is alive, breathing in the laughter of my grandchildren, moving in the steps of my children, and marching toward a future we once thought impossible. Legacy is not about being remembered, it's about ensuring that the ones who come after you live freer, stand taller, and dream bigger than you ever could. And as I watch them now, confident, unshaken, determined, I know without a shadow of doubt, it was worth it. I often wonder what people will remember about me when I'm gone. Will they recall the struggles I endured, the barriers I fought to break, or the quiet moments when I simply held my children close and prayed for a better tomorrow? At this age, legacy weighs heavy, not out of vanity, but out of yearning. I want to believe that everything I endured meant something. That all the nights I cried into my pillow, all the times I stood tall when my knees were trembling, All the times I was told no and pushed anyway were not in vain. But my story, I know now, was never just about me. It was always about the we. My people, my family, my community, and the ones who will come after us. One afternoon, my grandson took me to visit the new walking bridge built over the river in our city. As we strolled, he held my arm steady, but I could feel him slowing his stride to match mine. The wood planks creaked under our steps, and the water rushed below like it had somewhere urgent to be. Standing at the midpoint, I stopped. My chest grew tight, and I felt tears sting my eyes. My grandson looked at me, worried. "Grandma, you okay?" I nodded, pointing at the stretch of river beneath us. "This bridge, it's more than wood and steel. Do you see? For me, it's what life has been crossing from one side to another, never knowing if the boards would hold, never sure if the other side was waiting with open arms or closed doors." He listened quietly, and I pressed on. "When I was your age, this city wouldn't have built a bridge like this for us. They built walls instead, laws, rules, signs telling us where we could and couldn't go. But look at you now, walking freely. That's what all our marches, our sit-ins, our sacrifices were for. Not just so I could cross, but so you could." He gripped my hand tighter. "I won't forget, Grandma." That moment, standing on the bridge, I felt something lift off me. A kind of closure. My battles had become his foundation. My tears had watered the ground so he could plant joy. When I sit with my great-grandchildren, I don't start with the marches or protests. No, I tell them the smaller stories. How my grandmother hummed gospel while stirring beans. How neighbors shared sugar when cupboards were bare. How the old oak tree on the corner stood like a sentinel while children laughed in a world that didn't always love them. Because the truth is, resilience isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. It's your mama rising before dawn for a back-breaking job but still kissing your forehead before she leaves. It's your daddy, facing rejection and still walking tall. It's ancestors picking cotton with bleeding hands, still singing hymns of freedom. That's what I want them to carry forward, not just the battles, but the everyday courage that kept us alive. People think the civil rights movement ended when the marches stopped. But it lived on in the way we raised our children to demand fairness, in the way we built black-owned businesses, in the way we cast ballots even when obstacles were stacked high. I tell my grandchildren how we registered voters despite threats, how we endured insults and spit without breaking, how we refused to bow, even when bending might have been easier. And then I tell them, the fight didn't end with us. The baton is in your hands now. Run your race. They nod, sometimes with fire, sometimes with impatience, as young folks do. They want change to come quick. I remind them, progress has always been a long road, paved with courage, sacrifice, and relentless hope. Forgiveness was the hardest lesson. There were nights when bitterness tempted me, whispering that I should hold on to anger, that I had a right to hate the ones who hated me. But bitterness is like carrying a sack of stones that breaks your back before it breaks anyone else's. So I chose forgiveness. Not because they deserved it, but because I deserved peace. I tell my family this: you can fight for justice and still let go of hate. You can demand respect without poisoning your spirit. That is freedom no law can grant or take away. When I reflect, I see my life as a river, sometimes calm, sometimes raging, sometimes muddy, but always moving forward. It carried me from childhood under segregation, through civil rights battles, through the births of my children, through the losses that nearly broke me, and the victories that healed me. And what amazes me most isn't just how far I've come, but how far we've come. From colored-only signs to watching my grandchildren graduate from universities. From being told you can't to. Seeing leaders, innovators, and dreamers take their rightful place in every corner of society. And yet I know the journey isn't over. My river will soon flow into the ocean, but the streams behind me will keep moving forward. At every family reunion, before anyone leaves, I gather my children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren into a circle. I make them hold hands, squirming or not, and I pray aloud, "Lord, Keep this family strong. Remind them of who they are and whose they are. Let them walk with courage, kindness, and unshakable faith. Let them build bridges, not walls. And let them always remember they carry the strength of generations in their blood. Then I make them promise me something simple. Promise you'll tell the stories. Don't let them fade. Don't let our history die. Because stories are lifeblood. Without them, we wither. With them, we flourish. Now, as I sit here in the twilight of nearly a century, I know my story doesn't belong only to me. It belongs to the ancestors who endured unspeakable pain, to the activists who locked arms beside me, to the children and grandchildren who carry my laughter in their veins. I was born into segregation, but I will leave this world in strength. And that, my child, is my victory. So if you are listening, whether you are kin by blood or kin by spirit, hear me well. You are the dream of your ancestors. You are the hope they clung to in their darkest nights. You are living proof that strength outlasts hate. And if you ever feel like giving up, remember this old woman's story. From segregation to strength. From chains to freedom. From silence to song. I walked the road so you could run. Now, child, it's your turn.